gentlemen, welcome back to the Conventional Wisdom Podcast, part of the Freedom Cast Network. This is episode 2, and I'm your host, Samuel Vernon. Okay, quick editor's note. I'm new to editing these podcasts, so if you hear maybe an echo in the background or the sound is not quite right, just bear with me. I'm learning as I go. I am no Joe Rogan. I'm just some schmo in his basement. On that note, let's begin with this episode. It's quite I think it's an impactful episode. I'm redoing this. This is probably my third or fourth time actually redoing this podcast because I feel like I can condense these points and make them a bit more coherent. So today's episode I have titled COVID, but really it can be applied broadly speaking to life in general. It's not just about COVID, but I definitely want to use COVID as sort of the linchpin to this episode because for the past few years, I've been wanting to scream and shout because I feel like we have handled COVID so poorly. And I believe that in years to come, looking back, we will think to ourselves, why in the world did we make all of those decisions? I think it was all based on fear and irrationality and absolutely no wisdom. So let's try and find some wisdom in all this. I want to break down my problems. By the way, I probably have several problems that I'm not going to list here with COVID. I want to break them down into two main categories, two main issues here. One is the role of safety, how it interplays in our life, and the other one is the sovereignty of the individual, and we'll get into that. But first, safety, because I feel like safety probably plays a more personal role. It's kind of up close and here and in everybody's day-to-day life. So we'll talk about that first. And one of the things that I saw early on in COVID, and if you're like me, you kind of also picked up on this, was just the level of fear coming off of this thing. And it's a very interesting thing, everyone's response to COVID and the fear that it induced. So I got to thinking, okay, where's the appropriate level of fear here? I mean, after all, we're just trying to be safe ourselves. That's all well and good, but it definitely seemed that people were spun into a panic. So what's the appropriate level of fear? Okay, to take a simple example, let's say you're walking down the street and you come across a snake. Depending on your fear level of snakes, you are going to act differently, act accordingly. You could run away screaming, thinking it's the end of the world, or you could maybe sidestep it, move around. Some people might poke it with a stick and play with it because they love snakes. Okay, there's different levels of responses here when confronted by some sort of threat. Okay, but what should be appropriate? Because it's very reasonable that each person has their own separate responses based on maybe their history or their phobia towards this sort of thing. That's completely reasonable, and I don't have an issue with everybody having their own responses. What I have an issue with is the obsession with the fear. Let's say you have a reasonable fear of snakes, like most people do. What would then happen if you lived the rest of your life, went about the rest of your day, as if snakes were around every single corner? You shut your eyes at night and you had nightmares of snakes. You thought snakes were in your bed. You thought snakes were in your kitchen cabinets. Everything you did in your life revolved around trying to escape the snakes, trying to avoid them, and you never once got them out of your head. Clearly, that's not healthy. I would argue that is now a mental prison. You are basically a slave to your own fear. You're not acting with any sort of freedom and liberty to live your life how you want. No. Every decision that you are making revolves around that fear. If that fear had a persona, it would be laughing at you because it controls you. I liken this to the lockdown. I thought the lockdown was such a mistake. The amount of change in policy, the travel bans, the curfews, the closing of businesses, the not allowing certain groups, you couldn't congregate in mass quantities in certain buildings and all this, that is taking this fear and putting it at the absolute center of our lives. Because how else would you describe it? You literally could not, for 2 years, you could not live a normal life without the lockdowns, the fear, the responses around COVID interjecting themselves into your life. Whether it was going to the grocery store, whether it was going and meeting up with friends, whether it was traveling on an airplane, you couldn't do any of that without this constant reminder that COVID was out there lurking around the corner somewhere, just like the snakes. And by the way, if you don't believe that fear had something to do with the lockdown and everyone's response to this, and the change of lifestyle for basically everyone on the planet, let me ask you a question. What did you spend more time fearing? The virus and the effect, the physical effect that it has on you and your loved ones, or everyone's response to the virus? So how much time did that occupy in your life? Fearing that you might catch this virus and that it might have a serious negative impact on your health, or society's shift and change around this virus, whether it be your lockdowns, whether it be everyone's ideas of masking up or social distancing, all this. What did you spend more time fearing? Now, I phrase it that way because I 100% agree that this virus is extremely serious, and it ought to be taken seriously by each individual based on their risk assessment, like I talked about. I have no problem with that. In fact, if you are immunocompromised, or if you have some health risk, then I 100% support your ability and your right to be as safe as you want to be. You know, if you want to spray everything down with Lysol and hunker down, then by all means do it, because it's your life, and I want you to live and get through this virus. But I suspect that a lot of people took more time out of their lives to fear the social shift, the social change that came about because of everyone's fear around COVID. I'm just curious, were you scared if you did catch COVID? Were you scared of mentioning that to your coworker or to your friends or family? Because if you did, then they would look at you and be like, well, how could you catch it? That must means you didn't mask up, or you didn't get the vaccine, or you didn't social distance, you didn't follow all the rules. Did you ever fear that? Or did you ever fear the looks that you might get in the supermarket if you didn't wear your mask? I'm just curious. Now, those aren't life-threatening fears, and I completely acknowledge that, and that's why I phrase it as, what did you spend more time fearing? It's just an interesting question, and I wanted to pose it, and perhaps maybe it would make you think. By the way, did you ever have a conversation with anybody and somebody said something along the lines of, oh, I'm so sick of COVID. I'm tired of this. I want to move on. I don't want to hear any more about COVID. I heard that constantly, and I always wanted to jump out and say something like, you're not actually tired of COVID. You're tired of the lockdown. You are tired of the response. That's the thing that you're upset with, because they are not mutually exclusive, meaning we could have had the virus run its course and everybody remain open. Nothing changes any laws. Now, you can make the argument one way or the other whether or not that might have risked more lives and killed more people or not. But that's not my point right here. My point right here is you are upset with the response to the virus. You are upset with the lockdowns and the panic, the things that are independent of this virus. Because all too often people associated the lockdowns with the virus as if one could not exist without the other. But that is not true at all. We could have spent less time shaping our lives around the virus and more time living our lives despite the virus. By the way, I can already hear people saying that, of course, all the lockdowns, of course, all of the policies and procedures that we put in place was necessary because it saved lives. And after all, isn't safety just there to guard human life? And is not human life precious? Yes, absolutely it is. Human life is precious. But the reason why I disagree with that mentality is because that presupposes that safety is the highest ideal and there's nothing more important. So here's a question. Is there anything more important than human life or safety? And the impulsive youth would say, of course not. What's more important than human life? Okay, so let me restate the question. Is there anything worth dying for? Is there no ideal you can think of worth sacrificing your life for? Okay, I think you've already answered that question. Clearly there is. So I can think of a few, but for the purposes of this episode, talking about COVID, what I would put in front of safety, in front of human life, is liberty. So the question becomes, what's more valuable, safety or liberty? Well, I think that question actually is quite simple if you step back for just 1 second. Let's presuppose that liberty is of a higher value than safety. So if that's the case, then we have the freedoms to be as safe as we want to be, right? Because liberty is more important, it's more valuable, and we can wrap everything in bubble wrap, we can spray down Lysol, we have that freedom to make those decisions. But you cannot have liberty if safety is the highest regard. So if you're trying to walk down the street or drive a car or something like that, well, if you're not doing it in this exact perfectly safe way, then we're going to say you can't do that. And so all of a sudden your liberties get stripped, all in the name of safety. Now, that may be useful because you may save a bunch of lives by doing so, but it will be at the cost of liberties. So you can no longer have both if that's the case. And besides, the point of living is not just to be alive, it's to live a full life. And there is an inherent risk to living a full life. You'll never get rid of all the safety, and you'll never be perfectly safe. Now, a quick caveat here, because I think this topic got convoluted when discussing liberties and people's freedom to either wear the mask or take the vaccine or whatnot. So, when I'm talking about liberties, most people will confuse that to think the freedom to do what I want to do. But that's not the case. Nobody has, in a functioning society, there's all kinds of limits to things that we can and cannot do, but it's still not an infringement on liberties. I can't go around beating people in the head with a hammer, even if I want to do that. Liberty is not the freedom to do stuff, to do what you want. It's the freedom from. And there's a few things that we want to be free from. But one of the biggest ones is free from tyranny. And I will simplify it a bit more. I'm going to say we want to be free from external bondage and as well as internal bondage. And it's a very interesting thing, the other side of the coin that most people don't flip over, and to think that you can be mentally enslaved. And in fact, that's what I was talking about with the fear. If you're not careful, it's very easy to be a slave to fear, to allow fear to escalate out of control and to have it rule your life. Another example of this might be alcohol addiction or drug addiction. If you have a deep dependence on something like that, then essentially you are a slave. It's a form of mental bondage. So if excess fear can take away our mental freedoms, our mental liberties, then what took away our external liberties? That would be the mask mandates and the vaccine mandates. I'm going to lump them together really quickly, although I will separate them a bit later. But for the purposes of removing any sort of medical freedoms that each individual has, demanding somebody wear the mask or demanding somebody take a vaccine is certainly taking away my medical freedom, the rights that I have, that I was born with, to say that, hey, my health is my own, and the decisions I make for my health are mine and mine alone. So that was removed from us, and I don't think many people thought about it that way. I think most people probably just thought, well, I'm going to take one for the team, and I'm going to wear the mask, or I'm going to get the jab, and it's all for everybody else. And actually, that was a large part of what the conversation morphed into. But I will get to that a bit later. Right now, I just want to focus on if you're wearing the mask for you or you're getting the jab for you. But particularly if it's forced. Again, I just want to reiterate, I completely agree. If you assess your health and your risk and you want to take the vaccine and you've done your research and you want to wear the mask based on your health, I have no issue with that whatsoever. My main concern, and what I kept seeing over and over again with COVID, was a slow erosion of our liberties, specifically our medical liberties. And if we cannot make our own medical decisions about our health, then how is that not some form of physical slavery at that point if we no longer have the ability to make our own health decisions? And so in that way, I was very much against any sort of mandate that said you have to take the jab, you have to take the vaccine, or you have to wear the mask. That to me was a removal of my liberties, all in the name of safety. So the question becomes, is there ever a time when you have to give up some form of personal liberties, all in the name of maybe a collective safety or something like that? Well, I thought about this, and I don't really have a great answer, an answer that even satisfies me. I like to have some form of line in the sand so that I know when I've crossed some sort of ethical or moral boundary. But I don't, well, because for example, if this virus, all it did was give you the sniffles, then obviously nobody would want to go into lockdown. It wouldn't warrant that. And my argument would stand. Although if this virus boiled your skin and made you vomit your insides before bursting into flames and dying, and it was transmitted by eye contact, I think there would be a great argument for going into lockdown and stopping this virus if we can. And so it's contradictory. Well, I'll say a couple things. Number one, that was not the case. And it was pretty clear from the beginning that that was not the case. The virus was not the end of the world. Secondly, you know that saying is you err on the side of safety. So, for example, you're riding your motorcycle and you're deciding, well, should I wear the helmet or should I not? I kind of don't want to. It's kind of cumbersome and it's clunky to keep around me if I'm off the bike, and it doesn't really look cool. So, I don't really want to do that. But at the same time, if I get sideswiped by another car, I'll definitely want it. I should probably err on the side of safety and wear it. What you're doing is you're saying, okay, I'm going to give up this looking cool or the convenience of not having a helmet for that safety. And really, that's perfectly fine because safety at that point is of a higher value than the things that you're giving up. But I err on the side of liberty. So in this instance, if there's any confusion or there's any ambiguity here, don't err on the side of safety if you're giving up liberties. Err on the side of liberty. And in that way, you're preserving the greatest good. Okay, before I move off of safety in general and move on to the individual mindset versus collective thinking, I want to touch up one final point on wearing the mask, because I'm going to be honest, I didn't enjoy wearing the masks almost at all. Even if it was someone that had asked me politely to put it on and it was for someone else's health, in the back of my mind, I was kind of thinking, gee, you know what? I really don't like covering my face, and there's something demoralizing about it. And so the question became, and this popped up, and I did a lot of thinking on this, but if I'm against wearing a mask for some medical purpose or medical reasoning when I go into the supermarket, then reason would suggest I would be against wearing, say, shoes going into a supermarket or wearing a shirt while going into a bank. I mean, you could probably make a sanitary case for doing both of those, wearing a shoes and shirt. So I should, if I was being intellectually consistent, I should be against being forced to wear shoes into the supermarket. And it's kind of a difficult problem to parse through, but I'll just say there is something dehumanizing about covering the face, covering it with a mask, or even wearing a bicycle helmet or something like that. I mean, imagine a society where everyone wore masks or walked around with bike helmets on. I mean, you couldn't tell who anybody was. There's something very much unique to humans. That's how we identify each other. That's how we, see expressions and communicate feelings, is through the face. As an example, if I showed you a bunch of pictures of hands and feet and stomachs and shins, you're not going to know who that person is. Similarly, if I said Burt Reynolds, what comes to mind? It's not his feet, it's his face. We recognize people, we remember people. There's definitely something human about the face. And so covering it up, I mean, there's that expression where it's like, how can you show your face around here? Meaning you've done something so shameful or so wrong that's like it's so embarrassing to show your face. There's something shameful. You cover your face if you're ashamed. I mean, heck, even dogs know to kind of like look away when they know they've done something wrong. Covering of the face is somewhat demoralizing on a personal level. By the way, I would feel the same way on covering the female face in the Islamic world. In a sense, it's very degrading to cover up that part of you that does so much communication and that makes you recognizable, makes you human. It kind of puts you out there. So much of you is shown to the world through your face, and to cover that up kind of covers up the individual. And speaking of the individual, let's move on to this idea where you're not wearing the mask for you. It's always wearing the mask for everybody else. It's a courtesy to everybody else. Or how about getting the vaccine? You're not getting it for you to protect you against the virus. No, you're getting it so that we all have herd immunity and you won't kill grandma. It's always for somebody else. So here's a good question. To what extent am I responsible for my neighbor's health? It's worth thinking about, because I can think of there are some circumstances where I would be responsible. I would be obligated to help my neighbor. So for example, if my neighbor is in a wheelchair, he's handicapped, he's in his house, and his home starts to catch on fire, would you not agree that that's an instance where we should be obligated, someone, yourself, me, or perhaps say a fire department, would be obligated to rush in, risk their life, and save this person? Their health is the responsibility of the neighbors or the community at large. I can definitely be on board with that. But where it starts to lose me is if my neighbor is outside enjoying the sun on a nice day and I run over there and start applying sunscreen to him. Clearly, that's not my responsibility. Similarly, if someone is smoking on the street corner, I'm not going to go run over there and slap the cigarette out of his mouth. And it has to do with their personal choice. So the person is choosing to smoke a cigarette, the person is choosing to go sunbathing, but the guy in the wheelchair, it didn't choose to have his house burnt down. So there is some times where we have that obligation to help out our fellow neighbor with their health. But in this instance, taking the vaccine for other people, for your fellow neighbor, it would be like if everyone was responsible for putting on sunscreen applying sunscreen to their neighbor every time they walked outside. So you are elevating the collective over the individual at that point. And I actually had someone quite close to me who sort of asked me why I didn't want to take the vaccine or why I didn't want to wear the mask. And after explaining my point, kind of what I've explained here in this podcast, but not quite as in depth, it quickly morphed into, well, you're not taking the vaccine for you. You're taking it for those who are immunocompromised who can't take the vaccine, right? And that's a big problem with this collective mindset, with this group thinking, is because what ends up happening, and this happens a lot in communism, is you start to reduce everybody to the lowest common denominator. And so in that point, we are making our healthcare decisions based on the most sickly amongst us. So the person who absolutely cannot take the vaccine with all kinds of health risks and compromises to their health, we are now reducing ourselves and reducing our liberties down to this person, and sort of our base health standard is to that person. When in reality, most people, in fact, I don't know what the percentage is, but I'm safe in saying most people could get the vaccine and are relatively healthy, and we're not immunocompromised in all of this. And so we would be reducing everybody down to the few. Similarly, in communism, there's no income inequality in communism because everyone's poor. It just reduces everybody down. Now, I don't really want to get too deep into communism. If you think communism is good, then maybe we'll talk about that in a future episode. But I think a lot of people realize the harms in communism. But one thing I will say about communism, where communism actually has worked in the past and is actually really great, and I'm not even joking, it's within the family unit. So I will say that about communism. It works great in the nuclear family, because isn't communism all from each their ability to each their needs, something like that. Well, in the nuclear family, you have a few that work, that produce all the labor, that bring home the quote unquote bacon, and then you have a few that cannot work, that refuse to work, that consume most of the resources. And so communism works great. Well, that's because everybody in a family, you actually have a reason to care about those people in your family. Communism doesn't scale very well because as soon as you break outside the family and start going into the community at large, you start to have less and less things in common with them as you move out. So anyway, that's for another episode. So this idea of the individual being superseded by the collective was very prevalent throughout COVID, because you would always hear, hey, you're not getting the vaccine for your health, it's always for everyone else, right? That was always the arguments that I heard. I never agreed with it, and I never really liked that argument. I thought it was a bit disingenuous. But the question, it's a hard one to grapple with, because is there ever any times where your personal independence, your personal liberties ought to be superseded by the greater good, because your good is not as good as the greater good, almost by definition. So your liberties and your independences are second to the greater good, right? The good of all mankind, of the collective. Well, I would say this. A group is made up of its parts, and the good of the group is nothing without the good of the individuals within that group. So, for example, you cannot have a good country if it's filled with evil and corrupt people. Almost by definition, that is no longer a good country, it's an evil and bad country. So the good of the group can only exist if each individual is also exhibiting that good. So what's good for me, what's good for you, summed all together creates the collective good. And so by definition, you would no longer have the greatest good, because you are removing personal liberties and supplanting it with the collective safety. And if we agree that what we value is the good, I mean, we wouldn't value it if it wasn't good. So if liberty, as I've discussed previously, is more valuable than safety, then it's no longer the collective good to be removing any of these individual liberties for a group safety. You will recall that Ben Franklin famously said, if you give up some essential liberty for temporary safety, you deserve neither liberty nor safety. And it's very applicable here. So I'm very suspicious of people whenever they start to talk about the collective good, because I think what they're trying to do is they're trying to interject some individual harm in order to make a collective good, when the whole is just a sum of its parts. And so you really don't have a greater good at that point. You are trying to elevate some value above where it's supposed to be. And I'm very cautious when people start talking about that. So let's wrap up. I wanted to talk about, just in broad strokes, about COVID, because my thinking is that I don't want to get too deep into the weeds and discuss, stats and the scientific data behind the virus and all this, because what if something were to happen like this again? What if another virus were to occur? What if another threatening thing came along and we didn't know anything about this new danger? What are we going to just sit around until we know everything about it to make our decisions? Or we should have some sort of guide. We should be able to apply some conventional wisdom to this new threat so that we don't keep fear in the center of our lives. At that point, we become mental slaves to fear, and we're no longer living full, decent lives because we're preoccupied with fear. And to know that also we cannot substitute our liberties for safety, because at that point, we are now physical slaves. We are not free to make our own health decisions. And finally, to know that we cannot give up the sanctity of the individual for the collective good, because the group is made up of its parts, and the greater good is made up of the good of the individual. And to remove the liberties of the individual in the name of safety is to reduce the collective good. I'd like to thank you for listening to Some Conventional Wisdom. I'm Samuel Vernon, and I'll see you next time.